Abraham was not justified by faith in chapter 14 when he believed that God was the Most High God, the possessor of heaven and earth. God did not count that kind of faith to him as righteousness. What kind of faith was it that was reckoned to Abraham as righteousness? It was the faith that believed that God was able to work something into him to bring forth the seed. Believing that God will supply our daily needs, our daily food is good, but it is not that kind of faith that is precious in the eyes of God. What kind of faith is precious in God's sight? The faith that believes that He is able to work Himself into us to bring forth Christ. Most Christians today only care for the faith that believes that God can do outward things for them. That kind of faith believes that God is able to give them health, healing, a good job, or a promotion. Many Christians only have that kind of faith. Although that kind of faith is good, it is not the faith that is so dear and precious in the eyes of God. He did not count that kind of faith as righteousness to Abraham. The kind of faith that was counted as righteousness to Abraham was the faith that God was able to work something into him to bring forth a seed. In Genesis 15, Abraham did not believe that God would give him bread and butter, cattle, or more servants. He believed that God was able to work something into him and bring forth a seed. What kind of faith do you have? Most Christians appreciate the faith that believes that God will provide all they need for their daily living. That is the faith that believes in God as the Most High God, as the possessor of heaven and earth. Perhaps you are thinking that you would be satisfied to have such a faith as that. After reading the last message, you might have tried to believe in the Most High God, believing that God, our God, is the possessor of heaven and earth. But that faith is not the faith that is so dear and precious in the eyes of God. We need to have the faith that believes that God is working Himself into us, the faith that believes that a heavenly seed will be brought forth by something that has been wrought into us. May this matter be inscribed into our being. Two categories of God's doings for the court, for Him to assist. Prior to chapter 15, Abraham had experienced God as the one who protected him and provided many material things. Abraham had given all the choices to Lot and had gained the victory over the four kings. None of these things, however, had anything to do with the fulfillment of God's purpose, but were only related to Abraham's assistance. He experienced all this outwardly in his environment, not inwardly in his life. For him to fulfill God's purpose, do you know what God's purpose is? God's purpose is to have a people to express Him with His image, represent Him with His dominion, and take the earth for His kingdom. Beginning with Genesis chapter 1 verse 26, we see that God's eternal purpose is to have a people expressing Him in His image, representing Him with His dominion, and taking over the earth for His kingdom. When God came in to call Abraham, He promised Abraham that he would have the blessing to express God and become a great nation, so that through him God might have His kingdom on earth. This is God's eternal purpose today. But everything that had happened to Abraham prior to Genesis 15 had nothing to do with the fulfillment of God's purpose. It is from chapter 15 to chapter 24 that we have a record showing us how God had worked something into Abraham so that he was able to fulfill God's purpose. It was no longer merely outward experiences in environment, but inward experiences in life. Most Christians today only care for their existence, not for God's eternal purpose. Even many among us still have not been deeply impressed with God's eternal purpose. Many are still hoping that the Lord will give them a better job, a good husband or wife, a good education, or an excellent promotion. While all of these things may enable you to assist, they have nothing to do directly with the fulfillment of God's purpose. Everything prior to chapter 15 was good, helpful, and profitable for Abraham's assistance, enabling him to live as a human being. But none of those things had anything to do directly with the fulfillment of God's purpose. Look into Abraham's situation. Could the cattle that Abraham gained in Egypt express God? Could the maidservants represent God? Although God had given Abraham a great deal, nothing that he had was useful for the fulfillment of God's purpose. To assist is one thing, and to fulfill God's purpose is another. The principle is the same with us today. Our education, jobs, and houses are all good for our existence, but none of them are good for the fulfilling of God's purpose. Two things needed for the fulfillment of God's purpose: the seed. Now we need to see the two things that were necessary for the fulfillment of God's purpose in Abraham's day. The first item was the seed. God called Abraham with the intention of fulfilling his purpose. As we have seen, his purpose is to have a people in his image to express himself, and with his dominion to represent himself. But Abraham did not have a seed. How could Abraham fulfill God's purpose without having a seed? God needs the seed. He needs to have a people through the seed. Not what Abraham had. Abraham was the same as we are, and we are the same as he was. When Abraham understood that he needed a seed, he counted on Eliezer. Abraham seemed to say, "Now I realize that I must have a seed for God to have a people. Since I am old and my wife is nearly out of function, the seed must be what I already have." But God will never use for the fulfillment of his purpose the things that we already have. Whatever we have is altogether no good for this. Do not think that what you have is good for the fulfillment of God's purpose. What you have is just an eraser. Nothing that you have is counted. Nothing that we have is useful for the fulfilling of God's purpose. At best, whatever we have is not of God, but is something of Damascus.